Welcome back, everyone. If you haven't already seen part 1 of this series, where I go through the first half of Carl Schmitt's political theology, namely chapters 1 and 2, I recommend you go watch that video, because we will be covering and building off of a lot of what we covered in there. So, let's delve straight into it. At the start of chapter 3 of Carl Schmitt's political theology, there is another one of Schmitt's famous provocative opening lines. All significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, not only because of their historical development in which they were transferred from theology to the theory of the state, whereby, for example, the omnipotent God becomes the omnipotent lawgiver, but also because of their systematic structure, the recognition of which is necessary for a sociological consideration of these concepts. And towards this end, we're given a few examples to start with. He says, the exception in jurisprudence, remember here the first video we did, is analogous to the miracle in theology, and he connects the rise of the modern constitutional state to the rise of deism. Whereas deism banishes the miracle in the world and says God doesn't intervene in his creation, the modern constitutional state removes the notion of the exception and the decision and says the sovereign doesn't intervene in the legal order, like what Kelsen and Crabb said. And I should note here that I'm about to go against the mainstream view, which sees Schmitt's political theology, at least as presented in this particular text, as something that goes largely unexplained. On the contrary, I think that if you read this text, Schmitt very much explains his methodology. And another note of clarification before I go on is that we should know that when Schmitt says theology, he doesn't necessarily mean what the nature of God is. He's not saying because God has XYZ characteristics, politics also has XYZ characteristics. His argument runs more like, because people believe God has XYZ characteristics, politics also has XYZ characteristics. He isn't trying to wade into the nature of God per se in the meat of theology, but rather how people in a certain epoch understand God, and therefore politics. But from all that I've presented so far, it might sound like Schmitt's positing a just so story, where you pick a couple plausible examples and then come to overarching conclusions. But Schmitt has a couple arguments he's going to give us for the validity of the deep-seated connection between theology and politics, and I think by the end of this, I'll show how this isn't a just so story. So let's now turn to those arguments. The first of Schmitt's argument is that the natural sciences, with their predictability and mathematical precision, are not proper to jurisprudence and by extension politics. We touched on this last time when I cited Schmitt saying, in political reality, there is no irresistible highest or greatest power that operates according to the certainty of natural law. But he expands on his argument here, having already laid the groundwork in the last two chapters, through the metaphysics of the exception and the nature of the sovereign. Even though modern positivist jurisprudence pretends to be able to make politics scientific, whoever, Schmitt says, takes the trouble of examining the public law literature of positive jurisprudence for its basic concepts and arguments will see that the state intervenes everywhere. And Schmitt doesn't miss an opportunity here to take another dig at Hans Kelsen by mentioning the state's tendency to intervene to decide a controversy, which Kelsen's positivism could not solve, much less account for. In short, as we pointed out last video, Schmitt is asserting that some legal questions must be settled outside the established legal order where the subjective element of human will becomes involved. Like in the state of exception, totally negating any hope of objectivity and equating jurisprudence to mathematics and scientific laws. And to defend his assertion that we instead go to theology to better understand jurisprudence, his next point is how we can see traces of theology even in the positivist age of turn-of-the-century Europe. Essentially, he is showing how the contradictions within positivist jurisprudence actually point to a theological view of the structure of the law. An example he gives is how it's common for jurists and other intellectuals to hurl the accusation of metaphysics and theology at their opponents, and he cites several contemporary examples of scholars hurling these accusations back and forth at each other. He then turns again to Kelsen and shows how he, despite his best attempts to naturalize and reduce jurisprudence to the realm of the cold and calculating natural sciences, inadvertently proves the theological core of jurisprudence. He shows this through Kelsen taking influence from Hume and Kant, including their critique of the concept of substance. The exact details of this debate don't matter all that much. The main point that Schmitt wants to point out is that in the history of ideas, Hume and Kant are engaging with scholastic and other very explicitly Christian theological notions, including when it comes to the idea of substance. Therefore, when Kelsen takes Hume and Kant's view of substance and applies their implication to the state as he does, he is thereby showing that indeed theology is proper to be applied to the state and that mathematics and the natural sciences are not enough, even if Kelsen isn't fully aware of what he's doing. Meaning, Kelsen himself uses a very theological concept to craft his view of jurisprudence, even if it's only theological in the rejection of theology. This justifies something Schmitt said at the start of chapter 3. Only by being aware of this political theology analogy can we appreciate the manner in which the philosophical ideas of the state developed in the last centuries. So, a recognition of theology and its influence on the state is needed for a proper sociological consideration of the modern state, even if sociologists and jurisprudence scholars deny it. Since even Hans Kelsen, the arch-positivist proponent in jurisprudence, can't escape using theology to describe the state. While this argument is interesting, it does seem rather weak in itself, but I think that Schmitt's aware of this. In a sense, he's taken for granted that the reader is familiar with some of the earlier works of his, such as his book called Dictatorship and his book called Political Romanticism, which he references. Granted, I have not read Dictatorship, but I have read Political Romanticism, and in that work, he develops a sort of proto-political theology and makes a much stronger case for the connection between politics and theology. And I would argue here that where he really makes this connection between political form and theology is his essay Catholicism in Political Form, or sometimes called in English, The Necessity of Politics. All these works I wish to cover in the future. But another argument that Schmitt is making makes his case a lot stronger, although it's much less implicit and he doesn't clearly state that he's doing it. I'm referencing here his broader historical argument that he's making throughout this work and throughout really his entire body of work. He's pointing out how, strangely enough, a change in the zeitgeist theology coincides with the political form that the zeitgeist takes up, and I'll explain this more in the rest of the video. And Schmitt is also saying that these aren't just mere coincidences, but that there is something deeper going on, or, as Jonathan Pageau might say,
that symbolism happens.
So Schmitt has now established the credence of the deeply intertwined nature of politics and the structure of theology, even if he has to point to a lot of outside sources. And his next step is to formalize this process a bit more, and he seeks to propose and describe what he calls a sociology of juristic concepts, which is really just his particular method or branch of political theology that is contrasted with that of others whom we will encounter later. But before we can go into the details of this methodology, he feels the need to say that it would be erroneous to believe that therein resides a spiritualist philosophy of history as opposed to a materialist one. And here the text, in English at least, I can't say anything about the original German, gets a bit confusing. In the Schwab translation, it reads, "The political theology of the Restoration offers an exemplary illustration of the sentence Max Weber articulated in his critique of Rudolf Stammler's philosophy of right, namely, that it is possible to confront irrefutable a radical materialist philosophy of history with a similarly radical spiritualist philosophy of history." And it reads very similar to the C.J. Miller translation, which is up on the screen if you wish to pause and compare. I think this paragraph is confusing, at least for me, due to the way that the sentence is structured, but we can clear up the confusion by knowing that Rudolf Stammler, whom Max Weber vehemently criticized for his view of history, wrote, "History is nothing but the passage of the religious attitudes and struggles of mankind. In the last resort, it is religious interest and attitude to the religious which determine the phenomena of cultural life, including especially political and economic phenomena." For Weber, as well as for Schmitt, Stammler's idealist view of history and the historical materialism of, say, the Marxist, are two sides of the same coin, since each seeks to reduce history to a single cause. Max Weber says the following about Stammler. "In the above exposition of our historical idealist, i.e. Stammler, we have only to substitute the word material in the sense of economic for the word religious, and we then have, as anyone can find out for himself through the page references to Stammler's book, a largely verbatim, at least always faithful account of his depiction of the materialist conception of history." And Schmitt reaffirms Weber's criticism that both of these views are too simplistic and reductionist, saying that both these methods must necessarily culminate in a caricature. So while Schmitt in the text doesn't at all directly attack either of these two views really, he just indirectly cites Weber's criticism to do the heavy lifting, which can be lost on readers who aren't familiar with the context. But he then quickly moves on to critique Weber's notion of the so-called sociological method, not to be confused with Schmitt's sociology of a concept. According to Schmitt, the sociological method, which, with a view to certain ideas and intellectual constructions, seeks the typical group of persons who arrive at certain ideological results from the peculiarity of their sociological situations. Under this view, differences in legal fields can be traced back to the peculiarities of the jurist, civil servants, and legal dignitaries. While this method would take the Hegelian system and characterize it as the philosophy of the professional lecturer, who by his economic and social situation is enabled to become, with contemplative superiority, aware of absolute consciousness, which means to practice his profession as a lecturer of philosophy. While Weber's methodology might be useful for a writer to paint a portrait of a character, since it focuses on psychology and trying to determine human motivations, Schmitt does not believe it's a proper sociology of a concept because it focuses too much on trying to guess human motivation and fails to compare this conceptual structure with the conceptually represented social structure of a certain epoch, which is Schmitt's goal with his political theology, and he doesn't just seek to see how religious attitudes influence people's actions as someone like Stamler would want. And as a brief aside, it should also be noted that the version of political theology that I'm using, and I believe the only version that's translated into English, is an expansion of an essay he wrote as a contribution to a book published as a compendium of essays dedicated to honoring the legacy of Max Weber. The sociology of concepts that Schmitt advances, quote, is concerned with establishing proof of two spiritual but at the same time substantial identities. And he gives us two examples, one not being a case of this methodology and the other being the case. For the bad example, he says, it is thus not a sociology of the concept of sovereignty when, for example, the monarchy of the 17th century is characterized as the real that is mirrored in the Cartesian concept of God. This could be a specific reference to something, but if so, it's lost on me. Next, he provides the good example. It is a sociology of the concept of sovereignty when the historical political status of the monarchy of that epoch is shown to correspond to the general state of consciousness that was characteristic of Western Europeans at that time, and when the juristic construction of the historical political reality can find a concept whose structure is in accord with the structure of metaphysical concepts. This sentence is rather long and dense, so let's break it down. Carl Schmitt's approved version of political theology, or the sociology of juristic concepts, which the sociology of sovereignty would be a subset of, would consist of when the historical political status of the monarchy, meaning the type of monarchy, such as an absolute monarchy or a constitutional monarchy or even a feudal monarchy, is shown to correspond to the general view of Western Europeans at that time, and when the structure of the political reality of that time can find a parallel that's in accord with the structure of the metaphysical concepts. With this in mind, we can go back to the bad example that Schmitt gives us, and we can see that it is bad, in part, because the structure of the metaphysical concept, namely in this case the Cartesian notion of God, is the passive element that is downstream from the political reality of a certain type of monarchy, and thus one is seen as merely downstream from the other. For as Schmitt himself says, the presupposition of this kind of sociology of juristic concepts is thus a radical conceptualization, a consistent thinking that is pushed into metaphysics and theology. And I'll continue quoting Schmitt. The metaphysical image that a definite epoch forges of the world has the same structure as what the world immediately understands to be appropriate as a form of its political organization. Monarchy thus becomes as self-evident in the consciousness of that period as democracy does in a later epoch. But we have to keep in mind that this isn't a question of whether metaphysics/theology determines politics or whether or not politics determines metaphysics/theology. Schmitt explicitly denounces that sort of thinking in several places in this chapter. Let's note first that in the good example that Schmitt gave of the political theology method, the metaphysics or theology and the political structure don't have a causal relationship where one is downstream of the other. The two aspects correspond, literally correspond, and the other word he uses to describe the relationship is accord, and he emphasizes the two realms are analogous, not causative. None of these words imply that one is subject to the other, and nowhere can you get that in the text if you pay any attention and remember that he explicitly critiqued both the materialist and the spiritualist view of history for dividing the world into two and then making one half causatively subject to the other. Rather, Schmitt's method, he himself says, is concerned with establishing proof of two spiritual but at the same time substantial identities. He is attempting to show how the structure of theology and the structure of jurisprudence and politics are analogous to each other, and how understanding one allows you to understand the other, because a certain epoch's political structure will be similar in structure to that epoch's theology. Again, this isn't to say which one creates which one, only to point out that it is a fruitful sociological endeavor to compare their structures, since they both stem from the same epoch and its worldview, which will craft its jurisprudence in a similar way it crafts its theology. Examples that he gives of jurisprudence being secularized but analogous to theology is how the omnipotent God is analogous to the omnipotent lawgiver in jurisprudence, or, as we mentioned earlier, how the disappearance of the exception or the state of emergency is akin to the disappearance of the miracle in theology with the rise of deism. But to give a little credence to the mainstream view, I think it's very fair to say that at least in this book, Schmitt is, on a surface read, vague on what exactly political theology means. In order to surmise the information I've presented, I've looked at some of these obtuse paragraphs dozens and dozens of times, trying to figure out what exactly Schmitt is trying to say and understand the flow of his reasoning presented in this work. I think I've done a half-decent job here, given that many of the academic treatments I've seen of this work quickly gloss over his specific argument for the sociology of juristic concepts, or some outright claim he doesn't even try to explain it. How exactly they get that, I'm not too sure. But I hope that my discussion here has shown quite the contrary, that if you actually take the time to read the text very carefully, you can outline many points Schmitt is trying to make about political theology. In any case, while we might find this methodology interesting, we have to ask, what is the point of it? Why bother? And the reason seems to be that Schmitt is trying to find a reason why the notion of the exception has received such heavy criticism in jurisprudence and been pushed aside, and he's trying to trace down this origin. It's instructive that he says at the very start of this chapter, after his very long opening sentence, that the exception in jurisprudence is analogous to the miracle in theology. Only by being aware of this analogy can we appreciate the manner in which the philosophical ideas of that state developed in the last centuries. And he then goes on to describe the rise of deism, which sought to remove the notion of the miracle from theology, with its notion that God merely creates the world like a well-designed watch and then never interacts again with the world. But in crafting this genealogy, he is also crafting the possibility for critique. Schmitt's genealogy starts by opening up what might be called a new front, where jurisprudence can no longer pretend to be objective, neutral, or even secular, since a whole theological theater gives jurists a whole new arsenal of weapons to deploy in this debate. And the new weapons that Schmitt wants to bring out in this debate is what he refers to as the Catholic counter-revolutionaries, or the restorationists, as he sometimes calls them. Specifically, the Frenchman Louis de Bonald, 1754 to 1840, the Savoyard Joseph de Maistre, 1753 to 1820, and Juan Donoso Cortés, 1809-1853, the Spaniard. All of whom Schmitt claims deeply understood the analogy between theology and jurisprudence and developed their own theories of the parallels between metaphysics and the state that they used to critique the Enlightenment project, which Schmitt is very interested in. And this is where we begin chapter 4, the final chapter in this work. One of the connecting threads amongst all these thinkers, Schmitt says, is their recognition that their times needed a decision. And we should note Bonald and de Maistre were both contemporary critics of the French Revolution, and that Donoso Cortés was a liberal who underwent a dramatic turn in his thinking after the revolutions of 1848. This view is juxtaposed to the Romantics, and on this subject Schmitt wrote an entire book called Political Romanticism, where he says that beyond all their literary and aesthetic talents, which he doesn't deny, they are secularized occasionalists, where instead of God being the only being who can create true causation, it is the artist and his ego who can only create true causation, where nothing is taken seriously and everything has to become an everlasting conversation, and no decision is ever made. Rather, there is just constant irony and detachment. But besides just the advocacy of the decision in the revolutionary times from the part of Bonald, de Maistre, and Donoso, their politics, as should be no surprise, is heavily influenced by their Catholicism, specifically their notion of the fallenness of man, which is understood in a very Augustinian way, which they make no secret about, and their belief that neutrality is impossible. Thus, because neutrality is impossible, one must make a choice, Christ or Barabbas. A decision is demanded, and this is no less true for politics. For de Maistre, this choice politically translates to the notion that sovereignty, and by extension the state, rest on its ability to decide. And the state's source of authority for this Catholic thinker is the Church, obviously the Roman Catholic Church, with a Pope at its head who has the ultimate and infallible authority to decide. So the only way that a state could have true infallibility in its decisions is through its recognition that the Pope is the ultimate sovereign who can make decisions without any recourse to appeal. This view is in contrast to what is called Galatianism, which sought to emphasize the independence of the Church in France vis-a-vis the Pope in Rome, but at the same time it underlined the monarchy's power to influence the Church within its borders. Thus, every authority for de Maistre is good, because every authority, that is, every authority actually speaking, has its authority from the infallible Pope. And, since the decision is so important because there is no neutrality, and one must always decide, the act of deciding is more important than how decisions are made. It seems like for de Maistre, the wrong choice is better than no choice, for to try to remain neutral is in itself a decision which is an affront to God, while a wrong decision can be blamed on the fallenness of man. And at the center of Donoso Cortez's thinking is the depravity of man that is taken farther than Bonald and de Maistre even take it. It is taken even farther, Schmitt admits, than the Catholic view espoused at the Council of Trent, which leaves open the possibility of the natural good, something which Donoso Cortez does not entertain at all. What Donoso Cortez had to say about the natural depravity and vileness of man was indeed more horrible than anything that had ever been alleged by an absolutist philosophy of the state in justifying authoritarian rule. Schmitt further adds that Bonald and de Maistre's view of man's depravity pales in comparison to Donoso Cortez's, whose contempt for man knew no limits. For this, Schmitt is comfortable saying that Donoso Cortez retained the self-confident grandeur of his spiritual descendant of the Grand Inquisitors, here referencing Theodore Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. Thus, his view of history is one where the victory of evil over man is certain unless there is a miracle from God to avert it. In his own time, Donoso viewed the battle of good versus evil as the struggle between Catholicism and atheist socialism. And if humanity wants a chance at survival, it must make a decision to turn towards God so that they have a chance of being saved. But in his time, instead of a turn towards God, there are the bourgeois liberals who do not want to decide at all. Rather, they are the discussing class, who want to avoid making decisions at all cost about anything of substance. They want a king, but at the same time they want him to be basically useless because of parliamentarianism, in the same way deism wants a god, but to have him exit human affairs. They want freedom and equality, but also to limit voting rights. They abolished the old aristocracies, but were content with an aristocracy of money. Here, Schmitt points out that Donoso Cortez's critique of liberalism is actually very similar to the Marxist critique, although they take their solutions to opposite sides. Liberal institutions are seen only as attempts to postpone ever having to come up with a decision and go on ad infinitum talking about issues but never resolving them. For Marxists, the liberals are postponing the contradictions of capitalism and bourgeois society, while for Donoso Cortez, they are trying to postpone the decision between Christ or Barabbas, which, like de Maistre, he believes, is in itself an affront to God. But Donoso Cortez takes this even a step further. Because humanity is all but doomed without God, and God has to be affirmed with a radical yes, the bourgeois anti-decisionism puts human salvation itself in jeopardy. The liberal insistence on freedom of speech, despite its pretensions to neutrality, is in itself not a neutral idea, for it's based on the presupposition that metaphysical truth can be dissolved into mere discussion, which again jeopardizes humanity's salvation. Because Donoso Cortez, Schmitt says, anticipates the Last Judgment, a state of exception arises. Specifically, a sort of eschatological state of exception arises where drastic measures must be taken to avert the crisis. It's not just a crisis of the political order, but also a crisis of humanity's salvation. But these ideas are not disconnected. Politics and theology are not separate. I mentioned in the last video how Schmitt has an interest in the is-ought distinction with reference to his critique of Hans Kelsen, where he argued that since Kelsen explicitly takes the view of David Hume that you cannot derive an ought from an is, that Kelsen fails to have any way for a law to actually be applied. Likewise, it's evident from this work that Schmitt takes Hume's critique of the is-ought distinction seriously too, but he argues that in the same way we discussed last time how ought claims in a legal system can only be derived from a sovereign, ought claims in ethics more broadly, he seems to be saying, can only be derived from theology and God. My proof of this is when he says, all moral evaluations lead to theology and to an authority that artificially imposes an alien or extrinsic ought on the natural and intrinsic truth and beauty of human life. And it's for this reason, he says, that anarchists like Mikhail Bakunin and Proudhon become so theological, if only in its pure rejection, because they know that if God exists, then there was some other source of authority that exists beyond man himself. Thus, for Bakunin, he says, the only thing that is truly evil is God. But let's get back to the point. For Schmitt and also for Cortez, since all moral evaluations must lead to theology, when God vanishes, so does the political. The end of theology and the rise of atheism or agnosticism comes hand in hand with the vanishing of politics, and thus the vanishing of the decision altogether. Today nothing is more modern, Schmitt says, than the onslaught against the political. American financiers, industrial technicians, Marxist socialists, and anarchic syndicalist revolutionaries unite in demanding that the biased rule of politics over unbiased economic management be done away with. There must no longer be political problems, only organizational, technical, and economic sociological tasks. This kind of economic technical thinking that prevails today is no longer capable of perceiving a political idea. The modern state seems to have actually become what Max Weber envisioned, a huge industrial plant. So for Schmitt, liberal capitalism and Marxist socialism are just two sides of the same coin. Each wants to banish theology to the private realm and bring in neutral, technical, and scientific control over society and remove any need for the decision whatsoever since neutrality reigns supreme. For Cortez, who has his hope for humanity hinging on politics in the proper sense as based in theology and rooted in the decision and deciding, the end of politics and the end of theology is also the end for humanity. Thus, we can go back to the notion of the eschatological state of exception and Cortez's argument for dictatorship. With the revolutions of 1848, there is no more notion of legitimacy that people can take seriously. The period of monarchy had come to an end, Schmitt says, and because there were no longer kings and no one would have the courage to be a king in any way other than by the will of the people, he, Cortez, brought his decisionism to its logical conclusion: dictatorship. And in these dire times, such notions of legitimacy ought to go by the wayside to save humanity. Also for dictatorship might not be popular, but in these times he views it as healthy. Whether or not Schmitt also takes this view is uncertain just based on this text, but he certainly does seem to agree with many planks in his argument, and this is also evident based on his other writings. But in the work he constantly weaves between expounding his view and the view of Cortez, and the line between their thought becomes very blurry. Perhaps that is intentional, and Schmitt is alluding to the chaos of interwar Germany in the Weimar period and equating it to the chaos of 1848. We will touch on this more in future videos. However, I have gone on long enough for this video. Thank you for listening.